Oh, Super Mario Galaxy 2. This game seems to be more and more adored every day. While the gaming journalists loved it, the reputation around the game was initially very polarizing. At launch, you either loved this game or you hated it, and both sides were pretty vocal in conversation. However, over time, the detractors moved on. Since then, the game has not only been praised seemingly universally, but it has also been displayed in the Smithsonian Museum of Art in an exhibit depicting how video games are an artistic medium at a time where there was mass skepticism over that notion outside of the video game industry. Keep in mind, even games like Another World, regarded by many professionals as key examples of gaming as an artistic medium, were excluded from this exhibition.
Now I can just see how you young people love the bejesus out of this game, but I gotta confess, I don't get it!
I was massively disappointed by this game when it came out. The original Super Mario Galaxy was, and is to this day, one of my favorite 3D platformers, which is in turn my favorite genre in the medium. Needless to say, I really like Super Mario Galaxy. So why did this game disappoint me? Simply, it failed to engage me. I was really bored by it. At the time, I attributed my boredom to the recycled level design, assets, and other elements from the original Mario Galaxy in a I already played this game, so why did I pay $60 for a lesser version of it kind of way. This was also an outlook that was largely shared by many others of the time, but now...
Number 1. Super Mario Galaxy 2.
You know, it's funny just how little we acknowledge how the discourse around games can change over time. The gaming community loves to act like the current hegemonic consensus is a factual basis for what you're allowed to like or dislike and what you're not. Yet that consensus has more likely than not shifted at one point or another. We act like it's hard fact and unchanging, but in the end it's more flexible than we make it out to be, whether it be the consensus among the community or just our own individual viewpoints. It's all vastly subject to change. And you know what? On that note, it's been a long time since I've actually sat down and played this game from start to finish. So let's give this game another go and look at it as fairly as I can. I'm not going to base expectations off of the unrealistic ravings of children and fanboys, nor am I going to hold it to expectation of the best 3D platformer ever as a shining star of artistic expression in the gaming medium. I might bring up other viewpoints that may reflect that, but they won't impact my judgment of the game, because if I go down that road, I'm only going to be focusing on what the game isn't rather than what the game is. So let's go into this game once more, but starting fresh with a blank slate. And I do mean that. Literally, I barely remember a thing from this game. I have Mario Galaxy 2 amnesia, perfect! So to get some technicalities out of the way, the game performs beautifully. It seems no matter how dense the screen gets or how fast you're going, the frame rate remains consistently smooth. It's not going to show in my 30 frames per second recordings, but the optimization is fantastic. Also, saving in the first game could be a pretty slow procedure. Often I found myself getting impatient because I wanted to get back to playing more levels. Here, the saving is pretty instantaneous. Graphically, the game is more or less of the same quality of the first game, albeit with a heavier emphasis on cartoony and lighthearted aesthetics in comparison to the first game's occasionally darker and more detailed models and textures. However, the new character and enemy designs are really bland, especially with enemies and bosses. These don't even look like Mario enemies to me. They look like rejected concepts from Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, except more juvenile and baby-like. Thankfully, a lot of past Mario enemies that were either absent or underutilized in Mario Galaxy 1 are used here. The game has a very good amount of enemy variety. The soundtrack is alright. The first game has one of my favorite soundtracks in the history of 3D platformers, and this soundtrack falls in its style, albeit nowhere near as ambitious or memorable, with an added focus on remixing prior Mario songs, if not recycling them. That said, the music is very pleasing to the ears, nicely composed and beautifully orchestrated, but I'm not going to hum the original tracks from this game like I can with songs like Melty Molten Galaxy, Gusty Garden, Boy Bass, and so forth. The story, on the other hand, is atrocious, even for Mario standards. Despite the game not being the most story-driven, it's so bad it's actually distracting. While, yes, going into a Mario game and looking for narrative is like going into a fast food restaurant for nutrition, this is also a follow-up to Galaxy, which is better in that regard than anyone has any right expecting it being. In comparison, it's obvious that this plot tries to be simpler and thus easy to follow. However, through attempting to do this, it ends up contradicting the first game while also continuously referencing it. Is it me or am I getting an odd sense of deja vu?
Hey, Miss Pac-Man likes me cuddly, okay?
Oh no.
You heard the lady. I believe now's the part where you run.
Oh no.
Something wrong?
Funny. My pack sense is tingling.
Anything but that. No!
No!
Okay, so to recap, good presentation, great optimization, good controls and functioning mechanics, but with a terrible story in a genre and series where story is thankfully not a point of substantial focus. So this seems all well and good. Now all that's left to talk about is level design and pacing. This is going to constitute most of the analysis. Whereas the past 3D Mario games had expansive hub worlds to explore, this game has a small condensed one with a Mario 3-esque level selection screen in the form of Starship Mario. This, as is the case with most of this game's additions, was actually a scrapped concept from the first game. I wasn't a big fan of this when this game was new, but I've grown more accepting of it over time. This is still, out of all the hub worlds in the series, my least favorite by far, but I can also understand it being more appropriate for this game given its point of focus. Now, when Mario Galaxy first came out, people were heralding it for bringing things back to the precedent of Super Mario 64, saying that this is the true sequel to that game, and Mario Sunshine was actually treated as the black sheep of what was at that point the trilogy of 3D Mario platformers. However, when you actually look at the level design, Mario Galaxy is the black sheep. The game, while having similar structural setup to those games in regards to how the stages are tied together and how the game progresses, has level design more in the style of the 2D Mario games, albeit with a tad more exploration and taking advantage of 3D space. You are largely sent down relatively linear paths with the occasional side route often found by experimenting with your surroundings a bit, rather than being put into a sandbox environment and completing various objectives. Mario Galaxy 2 goes even further in this direction, and rather than focus on the planet gravity mechanics and heavily environment-based platforming and interactions, opts for more traditional basic block platforming. A lot of the time, the level design is less akin to the first Mario Galaxy and more along the lines of 3D Land and 3D World. Another thing of note is that earlier I mentioned that this game has very good enemy variety. At points, the game very well builds the level geometry around the enemy placement and both intertwine very nicely. In fact, the level design is the basis of most of the game's praise, or at least from the arguments that try to have a point. I would agree with those arguments if we were just talking about the first two worlds. After that, not so much. It's time to address the elephant in the room. This game was originally going to be just an expansion pack to the first game, but Shigeru Miyamoto, being impressed with what he saw, told the development team to go ahead and make a full game out of it. Honestly, this really did not need to be confirmed because it shows. This is one of the easiest development processes to decipher, and even when I was a dumb teenager when this game came out, I had a feeling that this was the case, and again, I was not alone in that. The problem was that the game felt more like an expansion pack than a sequel. In around, I'd say, 2012, the dissent was starting to fade, and this game gathered more and more fans who whined that these claims were ruining their childhood nostalgia when the game was barely 2 years old. Seriously. Then after this was confirmed to be the case, this then became an excuse to deflect criticism. What is perhaps the easiest thing to complain about in this game is just how little original it does and how much it takes from the prior games. From shoving nostalgia down your throat until you gag on it, to reusing level themes from the first game. Shiverburn Galaxy? This can't possibly be anything like a certain Freeze Flame Galaxy now, could it? That is beautifully lazy. It's like conducting a magic show like,
"Witness as I, the great magician of pants, hold this pretty penny before you." It's a very pretty penny now, isn't it? Well, witness as I cause this penny to vanish into thin air. You're all stupid, right?
Then, most offensively, this game doesn't just rehash the first game a lot, but it blatantly takes level design and bosses from it. Some of the levels in this game are just smaller fragments of levels from the first game, just textured differently. I've been told by some people that only the special world rehashes things. The only problem with that is that's complete bullshit. In fact, others have tried to spin that in a positive light too. I've heard people talk about how this isn't a sign that they ran out of ideas and yet need to come up with more levels and bosses to fill a quota, but rather they build it up like this is the Mario equivalent of Sonic Generations. No. Just no. Now, at this point, you might be saying, okay, it's time to get an extension for your browser that turns off comments, because you've been listening to too many angry children today. Except this wasn't from Internet Kids. This was from the Smithsonian. Fun fact, the game selection presented at the exhibition was decided by an online poll list.
There, now it's art. Well, what do you think, Squidward?
Honestly, it's easy to complain about how derivative this game is of its predecessor, and to an extent it is worth complaining about, but it's only a symptom of the main problem. In fact, because if anything, this flaw gets so much attention that allows other flaws to go unnoticed and left out of the dialogue. For one, the pacing in this game is absolutely atrocious. This game is practically the definition of front-loaded. In the first two worlds, almost every single stage introduces a new power-up and a new mechanic or reintroduces old ones. These stages are also very densely designed with good variation of platform placement and usage of enemies with distinct and diverse placement. The early stages are also really short too, so the pacing is really fast. Once World 3 comes around, on the other hand, the game starts slowing down to a crawl. As the game goes on more and more, it feels increasingly stagnant. The levels are designed alright, but the levels feel less and less passionate or creative. Rather, it becomes abundantly clear that these levels are just here to make the game longer. Individually, they're alright, but there's only so many of them you can play before it starts to wear on you. The game tries to hide that more and more by reminding you that the old Mario games exist and blatantly recycling and redoing things that were already done, but it's a weak and transparent facade.
Hey, do you remember Super Mario World?
Yes.
Hey, remember Super Mario 64?
Yes.
Hey, remember Super Mario Sunshine?
Yes. That game was creative. I miss that.
I could keep going on and on with that and run that into the ground, and chances are you're already probably sick of it, but imagine that constantly. That is this game. Also, when chucksters are the thing that are giving me the most joy in your game, there is something deeply and horribly wrong right now. By the time you reach Worlds 5 and 6, you're not even going to be playing new levels too much, and I'm using the word new loosely. You're going to spend a lot of time backtracking to prior levels. You see, this game has a very, very linear level structure. Now, a linear level structure isn't inherently bad by any means, but not only is that disappointing coming off the prior 3D Mario games, but even Mario Galaxy 1 was a slog the few times you had to basically complete everything. However, while that was mostly the case at the beginning, and the level structure opened up more and more as the game went on, it's the exact inverse here. The game is far more open when you start off, but then closes off more and more as you progress. Despite retaining the Power Star mechanic, which opened up the level progression significantly in prior games, you more or less have to do everything here in order to beat the game. Now, out of the game's total amount of Power Stars, you only need 70 to beat the game, and even that is more so than the original Galaxy. But instead of all of them coexisting, a huge chunk of them are in a special world which you need to beat the game in order to get to, and even then, a lot of the ones in the standard worlds are cut off to you. In fact, ironically, this mechanic ends up serving to limit the player more than any Mario game has limited your choices ever before. To clarify, throughout my playthrough of this game, I was trying to get every available star when it was presented to me as an option so I wouldn't have to go and backtrack, and yet, that's not good enough. There are star pay gates littered throughout the already very linear world map, and as you go on, they get really out of hand. In all seriousness, there is one point in World 6 where after satisfying one star barrier, you're allowed to progress to another star barrier.
This doesn't make the game feel artificially extended at all. No, sir! This game is as fresh as they come.
There are two kinds of levels you can go and backtrack to, one of which is the Hungry Lumas, which are a returning element from the first game. If you feed them with star bits, they transform into new levels. However, the amount needed to satisfy them in this game is ridiculous. If you're just trying to beat enough levels to get to the end of the game, you're not going to get them all. The only way to get them all is to grind incessantly. Then there's the matter of comets. In the first game, sometimes there would be comet stages which would take the existing stages you already played and change them around a little bit. In that game, you really didn't need to play these in order to beat a game in a standard 60-star playthrough, and typically they were alterations of levels that were fun and very replayable anyway. In this game, however, not only are they unimaginative, boring, and just blatant padding, but this ends up being most of the later portions of the game. And that's even if you have the foresight to pick up the comet medals while playing the regular levels. Otherwise, no comet for you, and you'll have to backtrack even more. Thankfully, I knew this was the case going in this time, so I made sure to collect them. Again, in my playthrough of the game, I did whatever I could do to minimize backtracking, and yet, backtracking still took up 20% of my playthrough, and that's not hyperbole, I kept track. Now, yeah, that's not a great statistic, but at the same time, that doesn't sound too bad. However, all of the backtracking was concentrated in the last third of the game. Now, think about that figure for a little bit. 20% of the game is backtracking during the last 33% of it. Almost 2/3 of the last 2 worlds is just you backtracking. For every new level you do, you need to go back and play 2 more levels that more or less are exactly like what you've already played already. This game is padding! This game has one of the most unbearable cases of artificial extension that I can think of. Between all the passionless levels just there to make the game longer, the star pay gates, the comet medals, the comet levels themselves, the Hungry Lumas needing that many star bits, and all the recycled content, I can't think of another game where the majority of the game is not only padding, but also this obvious and transparent about it. Also, going back to the issue of recycled content, you wanna know which Mario game Mario Galaxy 2 recycles the most from? Itself. For one, you have the aforementioned comet runs, but then there's the level design itself, and it's about time that I started talking about that, so I'm going to put this note on hold for a moment. As I talked about earlier, the game moves away from the environment-based platforming from the first game and opts for simpler block-based platforming instead. This is also a much less ambitious game with far less ambitious stages. The game doesn't try to strike lightning in the bottle twice, but instead devotes its focal point onto the block-based platforming. Now, in order to keep this kind of level design fresh, you constantly need to change things up in some way, whether that be through platform placement or usage of certain mechanics, and so on. While this kind of level design puts less stress on graphics artists and programmers to create more distinct environmental assets, it also puts them in a position where they need to create a large variety of complementary assets, and the level designers need to have a lot of ideas of how to use them. This game, at least initially, actually does a really good job with this. In fact, because of the level design approach and tone contrasting with the familiar controls formula and so on, this game actually starts off feeling like a legitimate sequel. There's more than enough familiar elements present, but they change it up a bit through the kind of platforming and level design on display. It's a much humbler game, but it still manages to be fun, while they're still introducing new things and changing things up. Once that stops, the level design starts to feel very copy-paste. The platform placement doesn't evolve, it stagnates and repeats itself. But it goes unnoticed because the placement is so forgettable to begin with.
I'm seeing double here.
It becomes more and more apparent when playing this game that they spent all their creative energy on the first third of the game. And again, considering that this was originally going to be an expansion of the original, they probably didn't intend to make 70 levels, let alone— Wait, how many stars does this game have again? 242! Are you insane? So when they were told to do more, sure, they may have come up with some new ideas scattered every now and then that could turn into a fun level. However, through most of the game, it just feels like they're grasping at straws. A complaint that I made in my earlier review is that this game doesn't have its own identity. However, clearly, it did at first. But again, that statement isn't without validity, because after a while, the game really just does not know what it wants to be and starts to feel simultaneously stagnant while also jumbled and unfocused. The recycling from Mario Galaxy 1 becomes a problem not solely on principle anymore. The problem becomes that the games have different level design philosophies, and the levels often go for a while with Mario Galaxy 2's concentrated block platforming before just plopping in level geometry from Mario Galaxy 1, and it feels really out of place. Likewise, there are a couple of levels where it goes back to Mario 64 and Sunshine's approach, one of which is directly from Mario 64. Granted, when these pop up, they are a friggin' godsend, but once again, the game doesn't incorporate them in a way that fits with the rest of the game. Either the game should have been more consistent and just found more ways to pace out and change up the block platforming better, or they should have tried to make a more variety-driven identity where these different philosophies could coexist, but it tries to do both and neither and comes across as very inconsistent and non-committal. Another easy complaint to make is just how easy it is, but when you actually look at the level design, it's not all that much more forgiving than Galaxy 1. It is more forgiving, but not by the most in the world. The problem with the level design as far as difficulty goes is that they throw way too many 1-ups at you. Even when dying, it's hard to make the life count go down. In fact, dying repeatedly increases the life count if anything. This renders the life system in this game pointless. I've heard more and more over time the notion that life systems are inherently outdated, but I strongly disagree with that. It just depends on the game. They can be inappropriate for some games, but life systems have their benefits in the right circumstances. All challenge in video games comes through limitations. Enemy and hazard placement limits where you can go. Time limits force you to be quick on your feet, and so on. A life system is really just another limitation that can be added, and the benefit of that is that it creates tension and stronger reward. Suddenly, half-assing the game doesn't become so much of an option anymore, and thus the player is forced to stay vigilant, and this can go a long way to make a game more engaging and rewarding. After all, the lesser the sense of failure and the risk of it, the lesser the sense of reward is going to be. Mario Galaxy 2, despite having a life system, is robbed of any benefits. It doesn't have the tension, it doesn't have the failure, it doesn't have the reward, and the game is less engaging for it. In my opinion, what they should have done is replace many of the 1-ups with clusters of star bits. Yeah, that might have seemed more trivial, but once again, in this game you kinda need those things as much as possible. The bosses are also a complete joke. They're mostly either bland, derivative, or unsurprisingly, ripped straight from the first game again. It is true that some of the bosses have you make use of mechanics and actions associated with the stage it's on. That's neat for like 5 minutes. However, they get so predictable and flow so similarly that it just gets old really quickly. It's another example of how this game is just derivative of itself. However, some are legitimately bad. Unfortunately, this includes the final boss. In fact, I was shocked when after I stood perfectly still for almost half a minute, Bowser actually hit me. You literally have to try to get hurt in this fight, and even if you put a cursory amount of effort into your performance, it's over in seconds. It's not even a bad concept at play here, and the music is outstanding. Remember when I said earlier that the music in this game is nice to listen to, but for the most part not very memorable? This song is an outstanding exception, but it's wasted on one of the worst final bosses in video game history, followed by one last contrived,
Hey, do you remember Mario Galaxy 1?
well, yes I do, because that game actually bothered to be fun and memorable.
I beat Mario Galaxy 2 again. As you can tell, I feel completely fulfilled in my life. What the fuck did I just do for the past few hours?
As a follow-up to Mario Galaxy, this game is really bad. Which is a shame because it certainly doesn't start off that way. The problem is that this game was forced to be way more than it set out to be and went on for way too long. Knowing when to start and end your games is an important part of game development, and sometimes it's better to cut off a little short rather than drag it into the ground. Unfortunately, most of this game is that descent into the Earth's core, and I honestly don't blame the development team for this at all. Really, if you took the first 2 worlds and the best stages from the subsequent ones and released the game as a standalone expansion mini-sequel at a reduced price point akin to what Black Forest Games did with Gianna's Sisters Rise of the Owl Lord, I would not be complaining here. Unfortunately, that's not what happened, and it's easier to point out this stuff in hindsight from an outside perspective rather than working in the moment with the team while you're a part of it. Though this may just be, at present, my least favorite sequel to a video game, and yes, that includes Pac-Man World 3. Both of these games are very drawn out and feel very underwhelming in comparison to their fantastic predecessors. However, while the creative choices behind this game are very derivative and dull, Pac-Man World 3 is completely insane, and consequently, I remember everything from that game. The game is so bizarre that it stays with you, it leaves an impact. Whether or not it's fun to play really, and I mean really, depends on the player and their tolerance, but it's really fun to analyze and talk about. This game, on the other hand, is so bland and forgettable that as I'm writing this script, I already forgot most of the level design again. If I didn't actively take notes on each individual level, this review may not have been possible, let alone as comprehensive. Now, just because a game is derivative and non-ambitious does not make it bad. Look at Super Mario 3D World, for example. This game takes the kind of platforming from Galaxy 2 and perfects it. This is the game Galaxy 2 tried to be. The game is well-paced, consistently well-designed, and despite being derivative in many regards, it manages to feel fresh. It's clear that the designers had a lot of fun on this one because, as simple as that is, the level design is consistently passionately put together, and they also change it up a lot more. And it uses assets much more creatively on much more of a consistent basis, and it remains fun throughout its entire duration. When it came out, it won over many of the detractors of the Mario games of the time, yet now I'm starting to hear more and more people complain about 3D World being derivative, which is fine, I can see where they're coming from, but then why does Mario Galaxy 2 get a free pass? In truth, Mario Galaxy 2 is by no means the worst game in the world, but it's one of the most painfully mediocre I can think of. Yet, it's given inordinate and seemingly unconditional praise, albeit hollow and empty. Meanwhile, contemporary platformers outside of the Mario series like Pac-Man and Ghostly Adventures 2 are very much like 3D World in this regard. Hell, it uses a lot of Mario Galaxy 2's mechanics, and yet it uses them a million times better. That game also has very similar platforming, yet it's also well-paced, it's well-designed throughout, feels fresh, and it changes up the level design all the time. On top of that, it can be really exciting. It's memorable, and it has a kick-ass soundtrack. Yet, that game is often criminally overlooked and just dismissed as mediocre. And yet, Mario Galaxy 2 is apparently the most fresh experience in town. This may be, at present, the most overrated game I can think of. There are legitimately big problems with this game, but when you bring them up, people will not only dismiss them, but again, blatantly lie about the game in response, which leaves me wondering if we seriously need Bored Gullet to moderate gaming discussions. I mean, the gaming community has a really bad habit of being super toxic and overly negative under the guise of being critical, not realizing that just going in with the expectation for something to be terrible, not challenging that upon playthrough, but instead cherry-picking for what just supports your preemptive viewpoint is not being critical, it's acting like a jackass. Given the internet's lack of nuance, I understand how people can be wary of critical outlooks, but that doesn't mean being toxic in the opposite direction and trying to silence any viewpoints that you don't like is the answer. That too is acting like a jackass. In fact, silencing perspectives that challenge the current outlook can also lead to the general decline of quality in games, and the Mario series is actually a very good example of this. Nintendo can be late to the punch at times when it comes to reacting to fan feedback in their games, but they have done it. In the GameCube days, a lot of the gamers who grew up with the NES complained endlessly about how different and strange the library was, which is now something that the GameCube is often renowned for. Then, when the Wii came out and the DS started gaining more traction, Nintendo started making more and more games rooted in familiarity to appeal to them. However, when this started going too far for its own good, anyone who complained was silenced by the fandom. We weren't supposed to bash New Super Mario Bros. Wii or Mario 3D Land or Sticker Star or whatever. I'd say in around 2015 or so, the pendulum started to shift again. We talk about this stuff all the time now. Games like New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Mario Galaxy 2 did very well both critically and commercially, so it's only natural that Nintendo kept doing them. They set the precedent of the Mario games to come. If the games are selling and nobody's complaining, what's there to react to? So maybe it's because people started negatively reacting to the endless derivative schlock that Nintendo's finally starting to change things up again.
Locality can feel your thoughts. No lie is safe.
With Galaxy 2, you get a brilliant follow-up that delivers on an enormous amount of creativity.
Now you must acquire a taste for freeform jazz.